Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. History doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. Not the first time. This has happened before. We've been here before. So we're asking why? Not the first time.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to Not the First Time. We're back. We're talking Cuba today. We're talking Cuba Part 3. We're excited. It's been a little bit since we last touched base with you guys, so we're going to catch up on a few things as far as like current events go and kind of where we're at in our timeline for Cuba. But for those that are new, it's a podcast where us three normal dudes sit down and try to figure out what the hell is actually going on in the world, because we are curious, and we hope you are too. And our ultimate goal is that if we can figure out what's going on, that you might have a better understanding of it as well. So we've been spending some time trying to understand Cuba and what's going on with the current administration's focus on Cuba and the history of it and how we got to the spot that we are today. We've talked a lot of good stuff so far, and we got another awesome episode ahead. So I think it's a good place to start. We were talking last episode how the administration is inevitably, seemingly going to move into Cuba, but it feels like we've been having a lot of time bought for us here with what's going on in Iran in the Strait. And so, what are your guys' thoughts? Have we not attacked Cuba yet because of what's going on in the Strait, or are there other factors at play?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's kicking the can down the road. What we talked about in that first Iran episode was that this could turn into something that lasts years. And this is what that feels like. We're 2 months in, nothing has changed, and it's just deadlock. And that's what this feels like when it drags out like this. They're dragging it down. They're kicking the can down the road. And for what big move? I don't think they have one. That's why they're continuing to just string us along. And I think they'll wait for the right opportunity. If they do move into Cuba, it will be maybe something like Venezuela, where it's in the night. You know, it'll come as a surprise, that's for sure. But I mean, in terms of Iran, gridlock.
Yeah, and I got to give a shout out to the administration for being completely inept, because they are buying us so much time for this series. So shout out to everyone for kind of your patience with us, but kind of the looks of the pace of this administration, we're going to be just in time. So we're in good shape here, boys.
Yeah, I mean, is this Cuba thing is this going to be an ongoing thing past the current presidency right now? Is this something that has United States' best interest in mind, or is this just something that, you know, our guy in office I shouldn't say our guy, the guy in office just can't let go of right now?
Yeah, I mean, this whole story is that.
Yeah, it always will be, because Cuba is a bordering nation. It really is. That's how we should look at it. And it will always be a part of U.S. policy and thought, because it's so close to us. It's an island that has access to our shipping channels, to our trade. It's right there, so it always will be. And we're just seeing an iteration of what we've been seeing since 1776 when we started this series.
Yeah, it's I mean, I think the countries, they're so linked by culture and history and all of this that it's not just going to end in one presidency. No one's ever going to be able to restore or repair the history of between the two countries. And I think it's very clear, like we've meddled in Cuba for so long. And on the other side of it, we've housed a bunch of exiles from Cuba, and we've allowed for, the political dissent that Castro faced to really ferment itself in Florida. So it's just these two countries are very linked. And again, our main source for this is Ada Ferrer's Cuba book. And as she said, this is a history of Cuba and the United States, because it is impossible to separate the two.
Yeah. I know we got a lot planned out today and a good episode ahead. Andrew, would you mind kind of recapping what we talked about last time, just at a super high level, just kind of bring people up to speed if this is their first time tuning in?
Yeah, I mean, last episode, we really ended things off with the U.S. finally occupying Cuba. And I think that is something else to remind listeners, is that the U.S. did have direct control of Cuba for a good 3 or 4 years, where we rewrote their constitution. We put a U.S. general as the governor of the island. And we immediately started to plug Cuba in to the American empire. We started selling them cars, appliances. We brought baseball to the island. We brought radios. We brought the mafia to the island. And Cuba started getting inundated and flooded with Americanization. And what this really did was start to foment and bring a lot of opposition thought within the universities of Cuba, because you're getting flooded with capitalism. And this is right at the time when communistic thought, this whole dichotomy of capitalism and communism, and is capitalism really a benefit to people, or is it just going to subvert and oppress people more? It's starting to bubble big time in Cuba right now. And so where we left off, I think we're in the 20s or 30s, and Cuba is really starting to become very anti-American at the same time that it's starting to benefit in a lot of ways from getting plugged into the American empire, but also with the Platt Amendment and with the plight of their revolution where they wanted freedom, they still don't have it. They're still under the Americans' thumb, and now they're trying to really figure out what to do. And those conversations are getting led by the students, by the youth of Cuba.
Love it. And complete throwback to our first episode on Cuba. My parents were just over today. They just got back from San Antonio. They went and visited the Menger Hotel, which is thrown back to when Teddy Roosevelt brought together the Rough Riders. They met at that bar, and they kind of like conceived this idea of what they were doing there. So I just thought that was a weird tie-in to what we're talking about today, that my parents were just there seeing that before they went into the Spanish-American War there. So, but anyways, throw back to the first one. Cameron, I know we're talking today on the on the part 3 of Cuba, and what are we talking about today, or kind of an overview of what we're getting into?
Yeah. So we're getting into it today, folks. And Ikas and I were talking before. I mean, I love the context of the story so far, getting the history of the island. But this next part is really when we're going to get into the meat and potatoes of the story. We're going to get into the characters that people know, the noteworthy, notorious, and recognizable names of Cuba. These are the Batistas, the Che Guevaras. We're talking Fidel Castro and his brother Raul. So we're getting into the names that most people will already know. But what we're going to try to do is really connect this part of the story, this transitional period for Cuba, into what comes next with the Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis and all that fun stuff. So we were going to try to kind of span a little bit more time in this episode, but really after getting into it and sort of finding examples of what we want to talk about, and then we have to give the context of it. Turns out we're not getting nearly as far today as we were hoping there, but I think it's going to be full of some really good context that sort of puts this all together, because we want to make this make sense at the end. Because ultimately, when we started this, our question is, why is the relations with Cuba the way it is, and why is there such a visceral reaction when we talk Cuba? And I think today's episode is really going to start linking some of these things together, and for all of our listeners, hopefully this starts making sense. So to really kind of go over everything again, we started all the way back in 1492 with Christopher Columbus and his actual landing on the island of Cuba. We've discussed the Spanish Empire's dominance and the brutality in the area, and we've explained a little bit why that rapid growth of said empire ultimately led to its demise there. We've talked about the figures of Cuba that made the early revolutions possible, with Jose Marti really headlining the lot. Marti is a person revered on all sides of the Cuban political spectrum, which in this story is pretty rare. He is one of the only figures that everyone kind of points to, and he's used throughout the rest of this story for various different purposes. His lore and what goes along with him only gets stronger inside Cuba in the 20th century, so we're going to touch on him a little bit more. We've talked about the Spanish-American War and the idea that the Cubans won the revolution only to see the American flag replace that of the Spanish. This island really has experienced so much in the 4 centuries that we've discussed so far on our show, but as I said, today we're going to start connecting those dots. We're going to discuss the ways the world has changed and how one man, born a bastard to a wealthy Spanish-born sugarcane farmer and his household cook, was able to reshape the island to first rid the political corruption that had become so prevalent in the first half of the 20th century, but then ultimately to become the man with the ultimate power in Cuba to tear families, friends, and communities apart. So, we're gonna hop into it. But before we get to Fidel Castro and the 26th of July movement, which is what his revolution basically becomes, we're gonna take just a step back again and go back to the early 1900s and the clause in the Cuban Constitution that allowed for full Cuban freedom after the fall of the Spanish. And of course, I am talking about the Platt Amendment again. So, we talked about this a little bit last time, so if you recall, the Platt Amendment was added to the Cuban Constitution by metaphorical force by the U.S. government after the Spanish-American War, and it established terms that the U.S. would leave the island and end its military occupation really only when the new Cuban government had met the U.S.'s conditions. It ended up being 8 conditions, all designed to keep the American government and, more importantly, the American businessman happy. The amendment itself ensured that the United States' interests in Cuba would remain safe and, more importantly, wildly profitable, even if the Cubans had their own government and took over their own country. Keep in mind, always important through the rest of this story to remember that the average Cubans did not own much of Cuba. The vast majority of the island's landholders were Spanish settlers, U.S. business owners, or the very few Cubans who owned it were the upper echelons of their society. For the most part, the average Cuban had just as little under this new government as they did under the Spanish occupation, and by design, the U.S. was trying to keep it that way. So on the surface, some of the changes made under the Platt Amendment did look good. The U.S. ratified tariffs that gave Cuban sugar preference in the U.S. market, which absolutely exploded the sugar market. But again, we have to remember that the sugar mills at the time were American-owned, so the profits were basically consumed by American business owners. So what this has led to was just massive wealth gaps in the society. The class system there it became untenable, and it really leads to exacerbating the tensions that kind of caused the rest of the story. So the revolutionaries, the soldiers, the students who fought for independence for Spain, it just felt like a huge slap in the face, and Cuba really hadn't rid itself of its imperialistic overlords, and it literally had replaced the old with a more powerful, younger, and closer behemoth in the United States. So, despite ratifying the Cuban Constitution in 1901, and after the first U.S. military occupation ended in 1902, they officially became the Republic of Cuba, and this is where we're really going to pick up today. And this era of Cuba is really going to be marked by Cuban corruption. So we're going to pick up here with not their first elected leader, but one of the more important ones, with Geraldo Machado y Morales. I will say up top here, boys, I had to learn French as a kid. My mother made me. I had no choice. So please, anyone out there who cringes by any of my pronunciation, I know it. I feel it. I wish I could do better. You're going to have to bring that up with Marguerite Sadler because, unfortunately, my Spanish is horrible. Anyways.
Yeah. Hey, there's this thing called Duolingo that you're on. How many days of Duolingo have you done, or what's your
We're
streak?
at 1,079, Rhett, and it's in French, baby.
I know. Imagine how well you could speak Spanish if you...
idiot.
Yeah, exactly. So I can order croissants really well.
Yeah. And that's super important over here. So
it really is.
Yeah.
So anyways, boys, so with Geraldo Machado y Morales, there we go. He was the president from Cuba from 1925 to 1933, held onto his power by the use of media and social manipulation. He used troops against his people and even political assassinations. Despite promising to run for only one term, he ended up running for re-election in 1928, where he won a basically non-democratic election where the opposition was entirely suppressed. He was the leader of the Liberal Party, which a lot of the early leaders were able to use kind of the populism to get into power. They were a lot of veterans of the War of Independence, but almost immediately when they get into office, you see one after another just fall into the same trap of corruption. So the ideals of the Cuban Revolution were quickly becoming lost because of the constant power grabbing and backstabbing across the board, but from the Liberal Party even more so, because they were the ones who were actively and forcefully voicing their displeasure with the corruption, only to have some of the more corrupt leaders possible here. So things got really bad in Cuba under Machado's de facto dictatorship. So bad that the U.S. had to step in 1933, negotiated with opposition groups for a government to succeed Machado's. Initially, the plan was to sort of ease out Machado and to make sure that he didn't have any control over the 1934 elections after his stunts in 1928, and to ensure that the framework of Cuba's constitution would stand. But kind of as so many leaders here, Machado resisted giving up power, and the crisis escalated to the point that the army revolted, and Machado was forced to flee the Bahamas or forced to flee Cuba and go to the Bahamas. Ikis, you want to kind of shed some light on the siege there?
Yeah, because how Machado leaves the presidency, like, not only is it batshit insane on how he ends up leaving office, but it does become sort of like an unofficial template in terms of how Cuba looks to oust corrupt politicians and presidents from Cuba. And how it goes down is that there's a literal siege at his president's mansion. There was a real grassroots effort against Machado too, which I think shouldn't be understated, where people recognize that he was corrupt. He's fixing elections. The economy is tanking, and there's a bunch of widespread protests all around Cuba. In one protest, there's 5,000 people that were outside of his mansion literally chanting for him to resign. And what he decides to do is have the police post outside the mansion. Things escalate. He orders them to open fire on the crowd, and 20 people are killed, 123 are wounded. And I mean, like, for comparison, in the Boston Massacre, 5 people are killed, not to compare these tragedies, but here we have 20 people killed, hundreds wounded. It was a point of no return. The Cuban army itself turned on Machado, basically said, "You've gone too far. You need to resign or we're going to remove you by force." Machado does eventually end up waving the white flag, and he has to escape while he's still wearing his pajamas in like the dead of night. He gets into a plane while there is an angry crowd of citizens. Like, there's like a literal mob running onto the runway, shooting at his plane while it takes off, which is absolutely absurd. And he ends up escaping, like Cameron said, to the Bahamas, and he eventually ends up in Miami Beach, where he ends up living till the end of his days, which is very fascinating.
What caused all this corruption of these leaders coming in? Is there like a single thread that every leader came into Cuba, they're like, this is the perfect environment for a corrupt whatever?
The sugar industry in Cuba cannot be overstated, how important that is to this story. Like, our business interest in Cuba, we turned a blind eye to a lot of leaders because the U.S. was like, hey, they're the ones helping our interests here. So, like, if you are one of these leaders, we're going to get into Batista here, but if you're one of these leaders that is good with the U.S. government, you can get away with anything, because there really is, unless the people revolt, which we see a few times in this story, there's no international pressure for domestic policy. The U.S. we didn't give a shit about how they were treating the actual Cuban people, as long as the sugar mills were profitable.
Yeah. So that, I mean, to simplify that, that's to say that like this corruption kind of existed in this vacuum because the U.S. government allowed for it and kind of were okay with it and wanted it to be that way so we could keep profiting from it.
Yeah, I mean, they still weren't a country of their own, is the other thing. Like, they are a puppet state of the U.S. So whatever leader is getting in there is going to have to play nice with the U.S. and ultimately look out for his interests and the U.S. interests over the actual country. I mean, this is what happens with a puppet state and illegitimate government. Like, your people that are in power are the ones who are willing to play the game. And the game never includes benefiting, everyday Cubans.
Yeah, it's a theme that just repeats itself. This is a very sad tale for the people of Cuba, just across the board. And that's why we wanted to talk a little bit about the people before Castro, because it's not like any of it was good. At any point. There's not a single person that we talk about. There's one person I'm going to talk about here in a minute who I really liked, and the way his story ends is just baffling. So, it's just it's a Greek tragedy all over the place. But At this point, I mean, after Machado had left the U.S., they went in there and they replaced it with another provisional leader, Carlos Manuel de Cespedes. But in 1933, one of the bigger names in the story here emerges. So this is where we're going to get into Fulgencio Batista. I think is how you say his
Fulgencio
name.
Batista.
Yeah, it sounds cooler when you guys say it. Well, he is an absolutely fascinating figure in this story. We're going to talk about him a lot here. He was born in 1901, which I think is kind of important because 1901 is the start of this era, the new Cuba. So Batista joined the Cuban military in 1921, rose the ranks to become a sergeant, and amassed a very large personal following. And in 1933, he organized the Sergeants' Revolt, which actually ended in the toppling of Cespedes' provisional government. But Batista would end up serving as the Cuban president twice. So the first stint was from 1933 to 1944, and the second one, and this is definitely the more infamous tenure, was from 1952 to 1959. We'll get into that part in a second. But his first go around as president of Cuba is actually viewed pretty successfully and peaceful. He was a great judge of character and judge of men. By all accounts. He originally consolidated his control through patronage rather than terror, gained support across many different groups in Cuban society, including the military, the civil service, and organized labor. So he built quite a coalition in his first tenure there. Although he greatly enriched himself during this time, so he wasn't an exception to that rule. He got a ton of money. He did do some good works in the country. He expanded the educational system, sponsored huge public work programs, and in fact, he was able to grow the economy quite a bit, weathering the long-term effects of the Great Depression and even into the run-up of the Second World War. In 1940, the Cubans adopted a new constitution, and this is with no Platt Amendment to really scar the document. This was a more progressive constitution. It was, but unfortunately, it was bent and abused to satisfy whoever was in power. It was good on paper, but they did not have a lot of safeguards for their constitution. So leaders like Batista were able to abuse the hell out of it. Batista did leave office in 1944 as the new constitution forbade his re-election. But like a bunch of people in this story, Batista actually moved to Florida where he bought a ton of property and land. And he was able to keep his influence there with the Cuban population. Because I don't know if you have any kind of thoughts on Florida in this story, but it is fascinating to see how many leaders end up in Florida. There's the Miami Pact that we'll get into probably next episode a little bit, but it's just 90 miles away and full of it.
It is, yeah. I mean, it's directly plugged into Cuba at this point. Again, Machado ends up dying in Miami Beach. Like, this is a Cuban president in exile that ends up going to Florida. And while all of these corrupt leaders are kind of cycling through, there's people that are leaving Cuba in mass waves this whole time. There's massive waves of exiles leaving Cuba, and they're going to Florida during this time period. And this is something that starts with the U.S. occupation well into Fidel's regime. So this whole time you have massive amounts of people moving between Florida and Cuba. So Florida is almost an extension. I mean, it is like a brother-sister relationship at this point between Florida and Cuba.
Totally. And although he was a very corrupt politician himself, things did get a lot worse in Cuba during the 8 years that Batista was away. He was replaced by Ramon Gruel San Martin in 1944. San Martin corroded the already shaky political system of Cuba and consistently undermined the new Congress and Supreme Court. So as I said, the Constitution was pretty feckless because there just were no safeguards, and San Martin ran through all of it. He was replaced in 1948 by Carlos Pura. Things did not change, and the political disillusionment just continued from here. By 1952, Batista had seen enough. And again, with the help of the U.S. government, he staged a bloodless coup to regain power. He was fully supported by the U.S. government for various reasons, mostly money-related. He was seen as the savior coming back to his people, but in reality, his second term as leader dissolved into a violent and repressive dictatorship. All right, so before we get into the violence and the repressiveness, I had mentioned this story last episode, and this is going to be kind of a fun one. So before I get into 1952 and the leadership of Batista 2.0, I did promise that I'd talk about the story of Eduardo Chibas. This is a leader in Cuba that has, I don't know, he gets maybe a chapter in there where they talk about him, but I just found it so freaking fascinating. So Chibas was a truly inspirational, yet massively confusing person. He was known for his outspoken views on the political corruption of the time, the rampant gangsterism of the government, and American imperialism. Actually, the first time that Fidel Castro comes into the story is as a devout follower of Chibas, and he joined the party in 1947 as a law student at the University of Havana and became a participant in many of his rallies. Chibas himself was focused heavily on the Cuban people. Reading his messages, his speeches, you can definitely tell that his heart was in it for, I think, the right reasons. He never gets to be the president, so who knows if he would have fallen for the same trap as everyone else, but he did advocate for economic nationalism, social justice, and civic honesty. But he was not a communist. And I think this is important to kind of take note here. He was not a fan of the ideology at all. And it might sound weird to us Americans, but even Fidel Castro at the time was a stanch anti-communist. Really, political necessity and risk would change that in the coming years. But as Chibas was anti-communist, so was Fidel for many years. But the story of Eduardo Chibas ends very abruptly, and not by way of political assassination or exile like so many of the opposition leaders before him. No, for Chibas, his story ends here at a recording studio where he would do weekly radio appearances. So, in a very weird and impossibly difficult moment to understand, Chibas took to his radio to broadcast a message that was supposed to expose the education minister's corruption. But it kind of devolved into him just ranting about political grievances before eventually he pulled out a gun and shot himself 3 times. He intended the moment to be like this last wake-up call, but due to the injuries, he died 3 days later. And kind of sadder than that, by the time he actually shot himself, the radio broadcast had cut away, so the general public had no idea what he had just done. And despite whatever the goal was, he did have one accurate prediction there that Batista was coming back and that he would use this coup to regain power.
It's just so representative of like how frustrated people were in Cuba at this point, where it is like self-immolation, like that famous picture of the monks in Vietnam that set themselves on fire in protest. It's a version of that where people are so fed up and don't know where to go that they're self-harming in the name of change, and it's just very, very intense moment.
So this guy's message, the dramatic side of it just didn't even make it out because it cut off the radio before.
Yeah,
brutal.
And, yeah, like
and did the story come out
Vietnam,
after that? Of like, I mean, did the news of him shooting himself 3 times come out after that? Or is that not known till like way later in history?
It came out pretty quickly after that.
Okay.
So like it wasn't completely lost, but he wasn't supposed to kill himself. I think the goal was just self-immolation, like sacrifice himself or parts of himself, but he just bled out after 3 days and died.
God, dude. And was his like inspiration and message, I mean, was that Jose Marti like influenced? And is that where, Fidel was like, is this all along that same path of Marti back in the day that these guys were speaking to and wanting to lift people up around?
Totally. Chibas is definitely a forward-thinking figure in this story. Like pretty much everyone invokes Jose Marti, regardless of which side it's on. But I think the way that we view, and after kind of studying his history, I do think he would be more on the Chibas side of it than kind of some of the more right-wing people that would invoke his name as well. But yeah, this is the reason I think he's so important is this is where Fidel starts becoming more politically active. Because apparently Chibas was a great orator, could give a hell of a speech, was really political, and it got people like Fidel Castro, who were young, brilliant. Like Igis is going to get into a little bit of the background of Castro, but that's the type of people that Chibas was able to attract. And it it's just an interesting part of this story that's like, hey, who knows what would have happened? Because he was popular before, they needed the revolutions and they needed the violence that is about to happen. But we will never know. Shot himself.
Yeah. Wow. And he was spot on about what Batista is about to do next.
Oh yeah, he absolutely nailed it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and less than 2 years after the death of Chivas, Batista had staged that coup that he had predicted. And this time he did not come back as the president that worked to improve the lives of the Cuban people. This time he came back as the brutal and ruthless dictator that kind of people know him as now. During that second reign of Batista, he had a concerted effort to control the university, the press, the Congress, all while embezzling just massive amounts of money. He became a very rich man after his first term. He became incalculably rich during the second reign here because the Cuban economy was doing well. This was a good point for them. We talked about it a little bit with the tourism from the United States. The Cuban on paper were doing well. The people on the ground in Cuba, not so much, but he took advantage of that. And he's participated in supposedly free and fair elections, but miraculously, he was the only candidate on the ballot. And actually, he suspended the 1940 Constitution and revoked most of the political liberties. But as we talked about a little bit, he didn't hear much from the U.S. government because he sought to align himself with the wealthiest landowners and the U.S. government. So, of course, that was not with the actual Cuban people. It got to a point that almost the entire sugar industry was in the United States' hands, and foreigners owned about 70% of the arable land of Cuba. In response to the growing criticism from the populace and frequent student riots, Batista turned to all-out censorship. He really embraced responding to protests with just insane violence. And it's a little bit of his downfall here. He actually had his own secret police, which I thought was a very interesting name here, but called the Bureau of the Repression of Communist Activities. And these people would carry out wide scale acts of violence, torture, and public executions. Okay, so we're kind of setting up where we're at in the story and where Cuba is, because the next part is going to be the most important thing we talk about today, at least. And this is with the tensions rising in the country. This is going to be the most pivotal event during Batista's dictatorship. And this would be the attempted attack on the Moncada barracks by a small group of revolutionaries led by none other than Fidel Castro himself. Ikas, I'm going to turn it over to you if you kind of want to run through what happened on the 26th of July.
Of course. And we're finally there. We finally got to Fidel. It only took us hours and hours, but here we are. I can't wait. Because Fidel Castro is just such a fascinating person of history. He really is. He's just the full representation of what humanity is in history, because he's just a rolling train of potential. There's so much to admire in him, and there's so much to hate in him. He has a lot of good qualities and so many bad qualities, and they all come out in really intense, different ways. And he is one of those people that it just feels like he was destined to live an insane, extraordinary life that he had. And despite his humble origins, like Cameron said, he was born to a sugarcane farmer father and a house servant mother. Fidel showed immense potential from a young age. He ended up enrolling in the most prestigious schools in Cuba, but he always matched his academic performance with an equally impressive athletic performance. In 1944, Fidel Castro was named Cuba's best all-around school athlete, winning the national prize for outstanding performance in running, soccer, and baseball. He was just really one of those.
Quickly, though, our president won his club championship for the 40th time.
Of course, and Kim Jong-un got a hole-in-one on all 18 holes. This is how leaders roll.
Yeah, and actually, for Fidel's credit, this was before he was in power. This was known, so actually believable.
It is. But this is Fidel. He's just brimming with potential, and he ends up enrolling at the University of Havana as a law student. He graduates, he gets married, and he starts a promising career as a lawyer. But like any young lawyer, he's very idealistic. He's closely following politics. And Batista's coup really broke something in him, especially as someone that's now plugged into the political system, into the system of Cuba. Batista's coup and Batista's just twisting and churning of power deeply affected Fidel. And what he did was file a lawsuit against Batista for violating the Cuban Constitution. He's really trying to go through the system, the proper channels. He's trying to be a heart of gold citizen and, he's suing the president of Cuba for corruption. This lawsuit, though, it goes nowhere. It dies, and Fidel becomes increasingly disillusioned with the system. And I'm happy that you bring up Chivas, because I think that planted a seed that if you want to make movement, you got to do something drastic, and you have to do something insane. And again, at Fidel at this point in his life, if anything, he's a man of action. And in the aftermath of this lawsuit failing, he decides that he needs to do that monumental thing. He needs to do something drastic. He decides on an armed attack on Cuba's second largest army installation in Santiago. And this is just as insane as it sounds, because at this point, he's a practicing lawyer. He's really a regular guy in a lot of regards, right? And he's now putting his life on the line. Remember, he's recently married. He has a promising law career ahead of him. He's willing to put it all out on the line right now. He's putting his life to enact change within Cuba at a very young age. And so, working with his brother, Raul, which he does for the remainder of his life, him and Raul are very close. Fidel raised funds for weapons, cars, supplies. He personally recruits his own private strike force of 135 young men. And this alone is amazing, in my opinion. It's a reflection of what his ability as a leader could have been. He's willing to bring people into his cause. He's wrangling over 100 people who are also now willing to give their life for what his dream is. Now, they wanted to time their attack to coincide with the Great Carnival of Santiago, hoping that this would distract the guards. I mean, they were literally hoping that the soldiers and police would be too drunk or hungover to end up reacting to this assault. And so him and his men also commandeer Cuban military uniforms. Their plan was to wear these uniforms. They were going to sneak their way into the base, take control of the barracks, and then inspire all of the soldiers to rise up and join them in their fight against Batista. Fidel also drafted a lengthy manifesto that he wanted to read on the radio after they took control of the base. And at the end of that manifesto, he signed off saying, "In the name of the sacred rights of the fatherland, for the honor of Jose Marti." So again, we're seeing the legacy of Marti come back into the fold, and Fidel is very intentionally fusing Marti's name into his own cause. And to go back to your previous question, Rhett, like everything that people do from here on out, if they want to legitimize their cause, they're evoking Jose Marti. It becomes like non-negotiable. Now, that was the plan, and it was good on paper, but in reality, their attack was a complete disaster. On the morning of July 26th, and remember that date, like Cameron said, because it becomes very important to the cult of what is Fidel later on. Fidel himself leads the attack on the barracks. But the problem is that his men were recognized immediately as intruders. An alarm was raised. They started getting shot at immediately. And they were also low on personnel because of the 100 or so men that Fidel had planned in that initial assault, only 40 ended up arriving and joining him. Most of them had gotten lost on their way, like just took wrong turns and were lost. And another big portion were held up in traffic at the carnival. Like there's like massive parades and they just couldn't get through the roads.
Hey, using MapQuest was not easy, man.
It wasn't. It wasn't. And it was a complete disaster. Fidel doesn't even make it inside the base. He ends up fleeing in a car that gets riddled with bullet holes. And it's again, one of those what if moments where like, it's not out of the question to think that one of those stray bullets could have caught him in an alternate universe and there is no Fidel. He eventually escapes into the mountains. Almost everyone in his party is captured or killed, including Fidel and his brother. They're captured a few days later, hiding in the mountains. So this attack, it's an unmitigated failure, at least militarily, because in terms of propaganda and symbolically, this raid becomes a mythical origin story for Fidel. This is a group of ragtag men and a few women who risked it all in the name of Jose Marti. They're evoking their national hero in a fight against tyranny. And I think it's a very American story, and I'm using American in the way that Jose Marti would, in that you have a common, everyday man taking up arms against an oppressive government in the name of individual freedom. This is what North America is all about, and that's all he wanted this to be. Now, in the months after the attack, people didn't really know what to make of it. No one supported it. They just saw this as a crazy person attacking a military base. But Batista and his government would make things very night and day in terms of what this is, because they started killing and torturing anyone that they suspected of being a rebel. Men were killed on the spot. They started kidnapping and torturing women that they suspected were anti-government. This included people that were already in prison or in jail awaiting trial. They were just scrapping trials and killing people. And this upset a lot of people, obviously. Like, again, this is against everything that was in the Cuban Constitution. It's everything that's in any constitution in North America. And all this did was prove the point that Fidel was trying to make in the first place. Like, Batista is a tyrant. The government had turned into a full autocratic regime. And so it wasn't really Fidel's attack that swayed public opinion. It was the government's reaction to the attack that changed everything. It was how, just like when Machado opened fire on the crowd outside of his mansion, there was a point of no return. Once Batista starts kidnapping and torturing women and killing people on trial, it convinced a lot of people that maybe Fidel was onto something.
Yeah, Nikas and I, when we were talking about this, he brought up a good comparison in history is John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. Again, another event in history that, on paper, complete failure. Didn't work at all, but the lore of the event and what it becomes is so much more important than the actual events of that night. So I thought that was a good comparison in our history. And although it doesn't immediately have the success, like Ika said, it was not something that people were like fully supporting. But as any good propagandist would do, they use this as like a mythical origin. And like they literally call it the 26th of July movement going forward. So his revolution is called the 26th of July. And they do particular like events going forward, protests on the 26th of July. It's just it becomes quite the moment. So it also is very go ahead.
Oh, just that, it's almost like you don't need to be successful in these things as long as you can invoke enough reaction from the people you're doing it to that you can win through those actions.
100%.
But I am curious. Do you guys know, is there any U.S. influence at any point in this, this movement? Is there any U.S. meddling that's happening on the side, or is this all like grassroots Cuban people trying to get their shit right in their country?
It's grassroots. Like, the U.S. is involved in the fact that they're still the overlord of Cuba, right? And like, obviously they corrupted Batista, and Batista had to play the game, and that contributed to it. But it's 100% grassroots. Like, again, Fidel is just a guy. He's just a lawyer that is so fed up that he raised his own private army and stormed a military base. So it's just, again, evoking the frustration that the average everyday Cuban is feeling.
Yeah, and the U.S. didn't care about the war crimes that Batista was committing or the crimes against humanity. That didn't matter. He was all for our bottom line. So they did not like Fidel Castro's movement. Any sort of uprising to topple another one of our puppet leaders, not a fan.
Yeah. And then so probably safe to assume, like, I know we talk a lot about how, the feeling that Cuban people have that live in the United States about what's going on in Cuba, and kind of the confusion that we have at times of like things that they're for and things that they're against. This seems to be something that they would be for, given what's going on and the reaction that Batista had in his government. Is that probably safe to assume there that this was, cheered on from afar, from 90 miles away in Florida, where a bunch of these Cubans had exiled to?
Yes. And I think depending on where we're at in the story, it might be the different set of Cubans 90 miles away, because it does kind of flip-flop here. When Fidel takes over, a whole bunch of people leave, and then they go to Florida, and the Batista people come back. So it just kind of keeps switching on you. So it depends on where you are in the story of what Cubans are saying.
Love it. Perfectly clear.
So after that, we're just going to have a little side note here on Castro's trial, because it's a fascinating moment as well, and it kind of leads to the lore of what this moment would become. So, Ikis, want to take it away?
Yeah, because this trial is literally a scene of like a Spielberg crime drama. Like, it's so cinematic and intense, because a few months after the assault, since Batista's government's killing everybody, there's a huge uproar. The government says, fine, We'll do trials. We'll put Fidel on trial. They kind of give in a little bit, but they bring Fidel into the courtroom like he's Hannibal Lecter. He's like chained up, he's handcuffed. They walk him in with armed guards, and right away, the first thing he does is lift his hands over his head to show the handcuffs to everyone. And he says, "You call this a house of justice? You cannot judge people who are already handcuffed." Courtroom goes silent. Everyone like looks to the judge to see what's going to happen. Judge slowly nods his head in agreement. The handcuffs come off. And immediately, this is just who Fidel is. Again, does a lot of terrible things, but he immediately takes control of this situation and turns from the accused into the accuser. Because he then also claims the right to represent himself. He's a lawyer, after all. And this also meant that he got to wear the traditional black robe that lawyers wear on Cuban trials. So immediately, he goes from a handcuffed prisoner to a lawyer representing himself, to the state itself. And so the symbolism of him wearing this robe seconds after entering the courtroom is just really amazing. As the trial goes on, he fully admits to planning and leading the attack. He also exonerates his co-conspirators. He says, "Those young men like me love the liberty of their country. They have committed no crimes unless it is a crime to want the best for our country." And when the judge asked what inspired the assault, Fidel fired back immediately and said, "Jose Marti, the apostle of our independence." So again, he's evoking Jose Marti into this cause. And the courtroom also erupts after he says this. Once he says Jose Marti's name, the place goes nuts and the judge has to intervene and calm everyone down. And on the last day of the trial, Fidel delivers a 50-page speech that goes down as one of his greatest speeches of all time. This is where he puts himself on the map as someone that's not just a ragtag rebel. This is someone to take seriously. And in it, he quotes Jose Marti, of course, but he also evokes people as Thomas Paine, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He recounts the English Revolution. He gives remarks on the French Revolution, the Protestant Revolution, and he's using history itself to legitimize his cause. And in this speech, we see the power of history, and that, he knows the right things to say and when to say it. And at the end of his speech, one of his most famous lines, right before the judge gives his sentence, he says, "Condemn me, doesn't matter. History will absolve me."
What a scene.
Pretty wild,
Could you
man.
imagine seeing that? Just incredible.
It's insane.
I mean, we obviously have like the benefit of what happened and knowing what happened in the future with Fidel taking control, but like at the time, what a rallying cry. Like, how could you not get behind that and support that and be like, hell yes, this is for us. Really crazy to see obviously what he like did with that power, but it's fascinating.
Yeah, this is a great example of using messaging and your propaganda, how powerful it can be. Like, just the simply taking off the handcuffs and giving the robes, like that, the messaging in that is incredible. And there's no money on earth that can buy that kind of thing. And that's what the importance of the 26th of July movement ultimately becomes, is it doesn't matter what happened that day. It matters what happened after that. And they were able to build on the reputation of this, build on this event, and it did jumpstart their public career. And they would ultimately ride this notoriety and fame once they come back. So this event literally changed Cuba's politics and history forever.
Yeah, just that like flip into that power structure by doing that. It's crazy. Just the whole room is immediately on his side.
He did he studied Jose Marti, and he is a direct kind of disciple of Marti, because essentially what he does is just hold up a mirror to the Cuban government at every turn to show, like, you're going to chain me up and put me on trial in a sham trial and you're killing my friends. Like, he constantly puts and shifts the dynamic on the government itself, and at every turn they do the wrong thing.
Truly amazing.
It is. Ikas, you want to kind of touch on Fidel's time in prison?
Yeah, because so despite this, impressive, self-representation in the speeches he gives, he is ultimately sentenced to 15 years in prison. For the first 4 months of his sentence, he's in solitary confinement, which messed with his head quite a bit, like it does everyone who's tortured through solitary confinement. But again, Fidel, at this point in his life, you can call him a lot of things, but at this point, he is a man of action, and he aimed to make his time in prison productive. He would spend 14 hours a day reading in prison. He implemented a daily schedule for his fellow prisoners that resembled a school program, complete with a curriculum. So he and his fellow prisoners studied politics, philosophy, history, math, and English. And every morning, he would gather his companions and he would give long lectures. History one day, philosophy the next. He read every classic he could get his hands on. Some of his favorite that he read while in prison was Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, Les Mis. He read the entire works of Sigmund Freud when he was in prison. He studied the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the Russian Revolution. What he was doing was reading to learn, and he was really trying to think deeply about history, human nature, politics. He essentially gave himself another education while he was in prison. And while most would submit and rot in prison, again, Fidel wanted to use this time to plan his next move. He was gonna be ready for when he got out, if he got out. And it's also in prison that he would be convinced on the importance of propaganda. He would even write to a friend of his while he was in prison saying that propaganda was the soul of every struggle. And he definitely ends up practicing what he preaches there. He really, really understood propaganda. I think probably even before he went to prison, when you look at what he did on that trial with all of those symbolic moves and everything he was able to say, he knew how to build a cult of personality and he knew how to build an image. And it's also in prison that he began to seriously study the works of Karl Marx, who is, of course, the father of communist thought. I wouldn't say this is when he became communist. I think he was studying everything at this point, and he saw communism as just another tool in his tool belt. He is a means justify the ends guy to the T. You know, again, he stormed a military installation. So I think he sees communism as another plight of common people, which is what he's going through, and it starts to plant a seed. But I don't think this is necessarily him turning into like a fanboy of communism, but this is where he's seriously studying Karl Marx and really diving into that sort of way of thinking.
Yeah, and I think it's important for all of our listeners to kind of understand that what Karl Marx and Marxism, what's written in the Communist Manifesto and what we now think of communism, very different things. And the Cold War is responsible for that. So when he's reading Karl Marx, like the Communist Manifesto itself it's just a political thought. It's not like the Red Terror and the Iron Curtain and Vietnam, all the stuff that comes later. So when he's reading this, it's not the communism that we think. And that obviously he is a big part of the Cold War and the communism to come. But at this time, like Marxism, it is very different than what we think of communism.
Mm. What is that allure of Marxism that he's maybe being drawn to at this time that he thinks is something that could, be a means to an end or justify whatever he's feeling needs to do? Do you guys have?
I would say the
that?
Russian Revolution, because again, he's studying every revolution he can. And one of the big ones of this era, a few decades earlier is the Russian Revolution. And again, this is one that's from an oppressed peasant class that took down emperors, right? Like this is, and so I think the allure is just an oppressed people, and communism was a framework for enacting a revolution, because that's what he's thinking about. He wants to start an even bigger revolution when he gets out, and so he's just, the allure is any revolution of any kind, and he's studying it really closely.
Makes sense.
Yeah, and the face value of the Communist Manifesto is taking the power to the people. Like, it's just redistributing the power to the working man. So, like, you can see how that would relate to someone fighting for their people in Cuba at this time, why that would resonate. It's only later that it gets bastardized. Okay, so despite the sentence of 15 years, Castro actually only served 22 months in prison for orchestrating and participating in the coup. Castro and his fellow prisoners actually walked out of prison due to a campaign launched by the mothers of some of the prisoners to free the rebels. In a poetic twist of fate, Batista actually signed the bill that ultimately released Castro and all of his cohorts. Before we kind of get back to Castro, though, this, as we kind of allude to, it took a while for people to have an opinion on this and for it to have the cultural impact that it would become. But during this time, we are going to talk a little bit about the student groups because they were way more influential in the months and years following the 26th of July before Castro comes back after his exile. So we'll talk about that a little bit here. So really on the day that Castro walked out of the prison, the most influential people and active groups opposed to Batista were these student groups. They were very, very active, very resourceful. And they started staging protests. I mean, as far back as 1892, you'd start seeing the first student protests in Cuba. And it does pop up pretty much through all of these corrupt regimes with various degrees of success, but you do see the first one back in 1892 when the students at the Havana University protested against the Spanish educational decrees. During the reign of Machado, militant student groups used strikes and urban combat to help depose the dictator there. And by the time we get to 1951, these student groups have become extremely well organized. Their protests and demonstrations were used to gain as much attention for themselves as possible, while also painting Batista and his regime as poorly as they possibly could. In fact, these student groups became so powerful, they were the strongest lobbyists for the pardon and release of Castro from prison. So it started as kind of a movement from the mothers, but it got across the finish line because these student groups had so much cachet to them. They had built such a force that they actually had to be listened to. All right. And then in 1955, the activism intensified further. The new organization called the Revolutionary Directorate was formed, designed specifically to oust Batista. This group operated very clandestinely with secret cells all across the country. The goal really was no longer peaceful protests, but armed resistance. The idea ultimately was to radicalize the general public, get people from the sidelines and put them into the game kind of thing. In one protest staged in December of 1955, a group of 22 students rushed the field of a baseball game, chanting "Down with Batista." They unveiled a banner with the words "Down with the Dictatorship" displayed. The police responded by beating the hell out of the students with clubs in front of the entire crowd. Not only did the crowd witness the events, but so did the radio listeners that day. And the broadcaster basically did a play-by-play of the beatings in real time. So even if you weren't at this event, almost everyone heard about it. He described it as such, quote, "The students are defenseless. They are not armed. They are sitting. They are on their knees. They are beating them. They are kicking them. This is a shameful demonstration. There is no name for this." And he said this on air while this was happening. The next day, the newspapers picked up on this and also condemned the violence. Even worse for Batista, at the same time the students were staging their protests, the sugar workers were also staging their own resistance. So still easily the most important industry on the island. This extra pressure of the possibility of pissing off the U.S., Batista was facing a nightmare of dissent at this time. In 1955, the government had announced it would reduce the traditional year-end bonus for the sugar workers, which resulted in a 5,000 worker walkout from the sugar mills. And like many dictators have fallen into the same trap, Batista reacted with extreme violence, and a lot of sugar workers were shot in the protests. Protests and demonstrations spread like wildfire across the island at this time. Other industries took to the streets to voice their displeasures as well. Textile workers and printers staged a solitary strike. Construction workers, tobacco farmers, and many others joined in on the strike and essentially shut down entire cities and towns because of these strikes. The mood, it's safe to say, in Cuba had turned, and many viewed the only way out of the Batista nightmare was going to be through violent revolution. And the country and its people were primed and ready for a man like Fidel Castro to come in and take control under the guise of social, economic, and political reform.
Crazy. So all this pressure is mounting. I mean, you're talking student groups. I know it's kind of just like a broad general term, but can you clarify, like, are these like university going students that, you know, are clearly rebelling and clearly protesting? But if Batista is, you know, the dictator and in charge as much as we're saying he is here, how is he allowing this to go on in the universities? Like, how is this being, you know, is this being taught? Sorry if I'm not like being super concise in this question, but like I see it as, I know universities like typically can have like kind of forward thinking, progressive thinking things taught, right? And if we have this like dictator in power there, he's allowing for that to be taught, or this is just all like going on outside of his control.
So really with the student groups, I mean, Cuba has a long history of this, and it starts in one small student group does it at the University of Havana, and then another one does it in Santiago, and it was kind of working like that for a long time. But when that revolutionary directorate was formed, that was like the first national, well-organized, every university had a chapter of it. Like it became a well-oiled like political machine, basically. So it sort of evolved. The student groups that I'm saying here, they evolved from very small to very well organized.
Okay.
And it's all sort of part of it. It's a little hard, I think, for us to understand. I mean, we had like Kent State and stuff in the U.S., but that was just one small protest. It's kind of all these groups started organizing together where you got the biggest impact.
Okay.
Yeah, and Batista noticed, like, he will shut down the universities at one point. Like, he shuts down the University of Havana because of these protests, which obviously is just fuel under the fire. So like he is flexing all of his dictator powers during this. Like it's definitely on his radar, and he recognizes it's a problem. It's one of the things that leads to the revolution is that he's literally shutting down the universities, which was kind of the spark.
Yeah, and Batista being such a like resorting to violence so quickly definitely hurt his cause. Like their student groups historically here, there was a lot of conversations and a lot of discourse between, student leaders and organizers and the people in charge. Batista did none of that. He just immediately went to violence. And that really is what kind of pissed off everyone across the country. So that's where you start getting these solidarity strikes across the board, is because now everyone's pissed.
Yeah. It's funny, like every example that we've talked about in this like pressure just building has all been a reaction, has all been a result of Batista's reaction to these events and just like the immense violence that he's showcasing.
Yeah, and spoiler alert, Fidel doesn't learn the lesson here. He does the exact same thing in a few years. It's for a man who studied so much history, he didn't learn from this mistake.
Yeah, because it's also like important to remember that for all of these presidents of Cuba, they are terrified of the U.S. invading again and basically saying, we need an adult in the room. You couldn't handle your shit, so now we're moving in. So they're oftentimes pushed to take these really violent, insane crackdowns to get things under control as fast as they can, because they are so afraid of another U.S. Invasion coming in and then extraditing them to some, Guantanamo, and then they're in prison. So they're constantly looking.
Yeah, they're all their own Achilles heel. It's crazy.
Pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's a good way of putting it. So while the proverbial shit was hitting the proverbial fan in Cuba, Fidel and his brother Raul were actually in Mexico, not licking their wounds. They used this time to really plan the revolution. And about 1 month into their time in Mexico, they met a man who will become a huge part of the revolution and success, and a man whose face will grace the front of many a t-shirt and dorm room posters for generations to come. Of course, we're talking of Ernest Che Guevara.
You've seen him at Hot Topic.
Oh my God, yes.
And
and
seen
honestly,
him before you knew who he was.
Yeah, for sure. I'm sure a lot of people will recognize the face and have no idea. And honestly, people need to do more research
1000%.
into this guy. It's infinitely
100%.
fascinating.
Truly.
So Guevara was an Argentinian doctor by trade, but turned revolutionary. His story deserves a multi-part series of its own. Just, again, absolutely fascinating character. From a very, very young age, Guevara was interested in politics, society, and anti-imperialism. He was extremely smart, a lot like Fidel Castro in that. He participated in chess tournaments by the age of 12. Super passionate about poetry, history, philosophy. Also enjoyed the works of Faulkner, Jules Verne, Franz Kafka, Vladimir Lenin, and Karl Marx as well. In 1948, Che entered the University of Buenos Aires to study medicine, and he had what was described as a hunger to explore the world, which led him to do some truly insane pursuits. In 1950, he took a 2,800-mile solo trip around the rural provinces of Argentina on a little bike that he actually installed a small engine to. In 1952, he took another excursion around South Africa, this time 5,000 miles on a motorcycle, visiting all different countries and areas. He'd find himself infuriated by what he saw all across the continent, from the working conditions of miners in Chile to the staggering poverty of rural Peru. In fact, one of the things that revolutionized Che is one of the things I know Ickes wants to cover very badly on this show, and that's the United Fruit Company and the Banana Wars. Ickes, you want to share just a second of what these are?
100%, because Che is this like roaming mercenary that is just going around North and South America looking for injustices. And at this point, it's not just Cuba that the U.S. is meddling in. I mean, it's all of Central America, it's South America. We have business interests everywhere. And a massive part of that was the literal export and import of fruit. That's why it's called the Banana Wars. And so we were invading entire countries, Panama multiple times, Haiti. We're going into Ecuador, like we're going all over South America in order to protect the fruit industry. And it's just another example of what people like Che are seeing is just constant old and new world powers that are oppressing people that just want freedom in a country of their own.
Yeah, and by the time Che and Fidel had actually met in Mexico in 1954, he was already a very well-experienced and well-traveled activist and revolutionary. Unlike Fidel at the time, Che was extremely sympathetic to the messaging of the Soviet Union and communism, railed against capitalistic greed everywhere that created these gigantic wealth gaps that he saw, loudly advocated for land reform, social changes, and going as far as to swear on the image of the recently deceased Joseph Stalin to, quote, not rest until all these octopuses have been vanquished. Guevara spent a lot of time in Guatemala, which is another fascinating little chapter here of the Banana Wars, but he was working with the newly elected president, Jacobo Arbenz, I think is how you pronounce it, to enact new reforms and policies to redistribute the large land holdings to landless peasants. In a wild series of events, basically a shipment of communist Czechoslovakian weapons were dispatched to Guatemala, which led the U.S. government to basically stage a coup against Arbenz and forced his eventual resignation. So there's another one. Add that to the U.S. list.
A side quest of his.
Yeah, a little bit. So super angered by the removal of Arbenz, Guevara joined a militia organized by the communist youth. They bombed the capital and they tried to stage different operations, but they were very ineffective, and that drove Che to leave the group and seek refuge in Mexico. And this is where he ends up meeting Fidel Castro for the first time. After just one night with Fidel, Che was convinced that this was the plight of the Cuban people, or that the plight of the Cuban people was the cause he'd been waiting for. And as biographer Simon Reed Henry coined it, it was a revolutionary friendship that would change the world. So at this point in both Che Guevara and Fidel Castro's life, they viewed the U.S. as the metaphorical puppet master orchestrating regime changes and installing repressive governments basically across the Latin world. Although harsh, not untrue in the slightest. As we've talked about here, the U.S. is in constant control of major systems of government, business, and economics wherever we possibly can. And people like Che saw that, and it really radicalized and kind of forced their hand into the rest of this. Che's specialty was guerrilla warfare, which becomes incredibly important to the events that are about to come. All right, so what happened next is the start of the revolution. It's a little bit similar to the 26th of July, the event of storming the barricades there, as the initial attack was not successful. The original plan was actually to invade the island with a 20-person yacht sailing from Mexico, but 82 fighters climbed aboard this old yacht with the goal of basically inciting a citizens' revolt once they got there. It started off bad. There were warnings from the Mexican government for all ship captains to keep the boats in port because there was apparently a massive impending storm. Fidel either didn't know this or didn't care, and still set off in November of 1956 to overthrow the Batista regime. The storm itself was definitely a bad omen for the expedition, as the attack on Cuba was a complete failure. Fidel and his troops were met by larger government forces that caused the plan to fall apart extremely quickly. From the very start, the yacht called the Granma crashed into a sandbar. They actually lost their navigator overboard. And Fidel was like, okay, we need to go to the nearest spit of land. And they did like a turn and ran straight into a sandbar. They were spotted by the Cuban Coast Guard almost immediately, and the military was notified of their presence within an hour. Around 60 of the 82 fighters on board were killed, and the remaining forces had to retreat into the mountains to regroup, or more aptly, just to escape certain death.
Wow. Just relentless assaults.
Yeah, it's amazing that there were so many failures for Fidel Castro, and he still was able to do what he does next. But yeah, the start to the revolution was not great. But after the news of the invasion broke, Batista took this opportunity to broadcast the defeat of his enemies. In fact, the New York Times plays a huge part in this part of the story, as they ran with the news that Fidel Castro himself had been killed in the assault, running off of information supplied to Batista, but to them by Batista himself. Of course, it was not true that Castro was killed, and it was actually the New York Times that revealed that Fidel was in fact alive. There's a badass journalism named Hubert L. Matthews who secretly traveled to the Sierra Maestra Mountains and interviewed the alive and well Castro himself. It was with the revelation that Castro first found his international fame and found himself portrayed as basically a romanticized revolutionary. And he found the support he needed for what came next. Batista actually didn't know that Castro was alive until the New York Times article came out. So Matthews, the journalist there, was able to hide basically all of this until it came out. And Fidel Castro used the New York Times brilliantly. Not one, to make it look like he's just a liar by saying that he was dead. And he used this moment to really get the international community involved. And this article from the New York Times is kind of what starts the lore that is Fidel Castro outside of the borders of Cuba. But we're not going to get into that quite yet, because we've taken you guys for enough time today, and we've gone through a lot of things. So for our next part of our Cuba Libre story, we're going to get into the reign of Fidel Castro. And this has been sort of a weird episode, because there's a lot of stuff that I think the three of us would agree with, and the things that he was fighting for, that we would stand on that side of the political realm. To this point in the story, he sounds like someone who actually cares about the Cuban people, and that this fight is in the spirit of Jose Marti himself. But we know that it changes, and it does change extremely quick. So next week, we're going to kind of pick back up here, and we're going to try to get through as much of this as we possibly can. I think we'll talk a little bit about the Cuban Missile Crisis, Bay of Pigs, but we're going to see a shift here of the man we've been talking about, and what Castro and his brother Raul do to Cuba for the rest of the story.
I can't wait to get into it, because he does, and it's not going to spoil anything, but he does become a twisted version of everything that he's fighting against. It's just one of those terrible arcs of history where in order to be a great man of history, you have to do terrible things consistently, and he falls into that. He ends up becoming again what everything that he was against he becomes, and it gets to the point where there's nukes pointed at everyone. Like, it gets bad.
Yeah, I mean, it's like what you become what you fear the most, right? Like, this is the classic story of leading up to this. But I guess if you're gonna start a revolution, like getting on a yacht, way to start that.
Yeah, there's no D in it, so it's GRANMA. So I don't know if I'm mispronouncing it, but yeah, I thought that was a horrible name for a yacht too.
Okay.
They left that one out in the New York Times article.
Yeah, I'm glad we clarified that there. Are we gonna get into the storming of the Capitol at all on the next episode, or are we just gonna kind of pick up where Fidel's in power?
No, we're gonna get into how he gets into power because it's a cool story too. But it happens quicker than I think we realized. That we'll touch on how the revolution works from here because obviously the storming of the beach didn't work, and at this point we're gonna pick back up when these guys are in the mountains, and that is a game changer. By switching the battlefield here and getting into the guerrilla tactics, that's when this whole thing changes. So yeah, we're gonna definitely talk about that. We'll talk about the trials that happened immediately after, the death pits that were found from Batista, all sorts of crazy shit. So it only gets worse here.
I do have some personal stories and experiences from that time that I can't wait to share.
Can't wait.
Really just fascinating stuff that when I learned it, I guess probably like 10 years ago when I was there, I had no idea the gravity of the situation of what I was learning at the time, and spending all this time with you guys, being able to actually connect the dots. It's so cool. And so I want to take some time to share that as well. But what a story today, Cameron. Good job, man. Holy shit.
Yeah, it's again, Ikas and I, we couldn't figure out where to stop giving context because every leader leads to the next one and their corruption leads to the next one. And then you have to sprinkle in the United States military occupations every so often. In the first 24 years of their republic, the U.S. occupied the island 3 times under the military. So it's just like, it's a shit show. And maybe that's why we don't know any of the history, because I don't think this is not a good look for the United States. Not great.
No.
Well, not a good look, and just like rabbit hole after rabbit hole, right? Like you can go down these things so far. And I think you guys are doing a really good job, like giving the important context and also hinting at what else is out there. Cause there's so much more than we could ever cover.
Truly.
Totally. And the ultimate goal is we do want to circle back to what's happening today to the Cuban people. Because, again, spoiler alert, nothing ends well for the Cubans. And what's happening in Cuba right now, we want to shed some light on it and try to help wherever we can bring attention to the plight of the Cubans. Because this country is fascinating. The history is amazing. The culture. Like, Rhett, you've been there and I'm so jealous of it. But we do want to honor the Cuban people because it's not something that we hear about enough. And after reading it, it seems like such an amazing group of people who just have gotten the short end of the stick literally every single time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Every time I leave one of these, sorry, Ikas, just every time I leave one of these, I find myself like just infatuated with wanting to know and learn more. And I wish that, I wish this was our full-time job so I could spend days
continue to listen and download so we could make that a reality.
Please like and subscribe.
This is where we beg.
There's that follow button that really does help us for the 500 of you that have listened to this out there. So
hey, shout out. Love you guys.
Yeah.
I'm proud of those numbers.
Andrew, though, well, yeah, proud of everyone. Proud of every download. Proud of every unit. Andrew, what were you gonna say?
I mean, I was just gonna you've been there, you've lived it, and even to the point where Raul Castro is still alive. Like, these people are still living. Like, this is still very real history. And so we're coming to the part of this story where the ripple effects of this is affecting everyone who's listening to this. Like, this is lived history now. Like, we needed the context because, as we've seen, Jose Marti is extremely important to understanding this entire story. Now we're seeing the ripple effects, the power structures in Cuba of today and the America of today. Again, there's an impending invasion about to happen, and Raul's still alive. Like, this story that we're telling is still ongoing, right? There isn't an end to this yet. So it's fascinating.
Yeah, this seems like an opportune time to mention this. Obviously, having been there and having had taken that trip with my family, my dad, we were talking about these podcasts, and he's like, make sure you take a moment to actually talk about the Cuban people, and particularly like how amazing they truly were to us over there, despite all this shit that's gone down. And despite the governments, I know I had that story very early on of that guy saying to me, like, I appreciate you being here. Like, you're you, I'm me, the government's the government. But I just do think it's worth the call out that, like, with all this craziness happening, we were still treated just like we were treated so well over there. Every person that we were with, every interaction we had, there was not a bad interaction in our times over there. And without like rambling on so long, like the picture perfect situation of what I'm talking about here is we literally got picked up from the airport by this driver, and he was asking us where we're going. We're like, all right, we're going out to dinner. We're going to this restaurant. It's this nice restaurant that was kind of on the beach in Havana. And the driver's like, how are you guys paying for your dinner there? And we're like, I don't know. Like we don't have any Cuban money yet, because you can't get Cuban dollars or Cuban currency in America. So we were on our way there. We figured we'd just go stop by a bank and get it the next day. And the guy's like, well, you're not gonna be able to pay for dinner. Hold on a sec. Starts going through these like back roads. My dad and I kind of looking at each other like, what the fuck's happening?
What have we done?
This guy's like taking us off this path. They're going these back roads. He pulls up to this house. He runs into the house and he runs back out, and he's running back to the car, and you can see probably his mom running out after him, like kind of like yelling at him, like, what are you doing? And he gets in the car and hands us a bunch of cash. And he's like, hey, you guys are going to need this for dinner tonight. And we're like, what? Are you kidding me? And they're like, all right, like, can you stop by an ATM? Like, how can we repay you? He's like, no, I'll get it from you tomorrow. And we're like, how are you going to get this from us tomorrow? And he's like, well, where are you guys staying? He's like, I'm dropping you off later. I'll just come by in the morning and I'll get it from you. And this guy didn't know us from whoever coming in there, had no idea like if we would follow up on that, if we'd come through on our end, but just trusted us with that and provided us a dinner that night. And I can guarantee you that the money he gave us for dinner, the reason his mom was probably chasing him out is because that's probably a shit ton of money for him to just like give these American tourists to go have a nice dinner. And I just think that that's just like the perfect example of how amazing these people were there, to whatever means they wanted us to have a good time and enjoy it. And I just think it's important to share that despite all the shit that goes on politically. People there were still absolutely incredible.
It's amazing.
Yeah,
so maybe that's
cool.
my
and honestly,
what's
it's
good in the
more
world
impressive
today.
that they're like that with the context of what's gone on. The Cubans have every right to be angry and to be resentful people or whatever. I mean, they're basically the Polish of the Caribbean. Like, just like their country has just been invaded and abused and tortured, and yet they're still resilient and they're still fighting, and you still see beautiful art and music and great athletes and all this stuff coming out of Cuba when they could have thrown it in at any time. So yeah, Rhett, any stories that you can share over the next few episodes? We do want to shed light on who these people are and what they mean to the world, because I don't think they hear enough.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so super cool. And Cameron, I guess to that point, it's like the worst times bring out the best in people, right? I think that's how it goes. These people have been through so much. If they didn't have each other and looking out for each other and treating people the way they have, like what would they have at some points, right? So I think maybe that's what causes them to share that love and care for others.
Truly. And I think it's kind of the point of this whole episode, and even to Jose Marti's dream of like a united America. Like, we all to our core want the same thing, which is to provide for our families, to be good to other people, to have individual freedoms and justice. And we should be closer. We should all be closer as countries and as people. And as we see, just corrupt power and greed and everything gets in the way. But stories like that, Red, I think really put that in perspective, that we're all way more similar than the media or the government tells us.
Yeah. Love it. Cool. Well, more to come, obviously, next episode. And next episode, we'll hopefully get to it. We'll get to it soon here. Do we want to close out with what's still good in the world? We feel like doing that today?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's hard to top yours, right, with this like personal anecdote in Cuba. But mine, I didn't really want to give it to this, but I am going to give it to The Odyssey, the movie, because I just love seeing the reception of it. I love seeing people rediscovering this story and engaging with it and having a quality adaptation of it, I think is wonderful. I think everybody should be reading these texts. Go buy it. It's required reading for children. Adults should be rereading it. And I just love seeing these ancient texts appreciated again and back in the public mainstay. So go buy a translation, read the Odyssey. You'll thank me later.
Yeah, I got to give a shout out to the Odyssey. It was like it was a assigned reading when you go into high school if you were in like honors English. So I think that a lot of us had the same thought of like, holy shit, I remember reading this. And unfortunately, I had to spark notes the rest of the books I had to do that summer because that book took me literally 2.5 months to read. But it's so good. So yeah, highly recommend. Ekis, what's the version you're reading? You've got like a shorter translation?
Well, so I read Peter Green's translation the first time, and then I just reread Emily Wilson's translation, which is great. I would recommend her translation. It's streamlined. It's definitely for a modern sort of reader, but still is like a direct translation of the Greek. So check out Emily Wilson's. It's fantastic, and she was the first woman to ever translate the Odyssey on her own. So it's pretty cool. She's like one of the leading scholars, Homeric scholars around. So buy her book, support her. It's great.
Well, don't tell the online trolls that it's a woman writing Homer. They'll freak out about it.
Yeah, I just unleashed the trolls.
Love it. I was gonna ship it in on what's so good in the world this week after that story there, but you guys talking about books and how important servicing these texts are, it does set up this perfectly. So if you don't know, Dolly Parton has a book club called the Imagination Library, and it gifts books to kids. And no matter who the kid is, socioeconomic background, whatever, Dolly Parton gifts free books. And we recently signed up for it, and we get a book sent to our house every single month for free from Dolly Parton's organization, partnering with local libraries for our kid to read as he grows and develops, and it's supposed to be with his developmental age. And I just looked it up online. About 3.2 million kids have registered in this, and she's gifted about 318 million books over this time across 5 countries.
Wow.
Which is fucking cool. So hell yeah, Dolly Parton, let's go.
What can't Dolly do? In Dolly we trust.
Just a
she is. So
that's amazing. Definitely support that. I think that's really wonderful. I think that's incredible. So if anyone's listening out there.
Yeah, my nieces both do it, and my sister loves it, and my nieces love reading. And I don't know if that's going to change when they see an iPad, but she's doing everything in her power to give them the books and get excited about Dolly Parton's Imagination Library. So love Dolly Parton.
Yeah. So
incredible.
Shout out the Imagination Library, shout out reading, shout out trying to learn stuff and get better. So here we are.
Amen.
All right. Great pod today, boys. Let's pick it up next time for Cuba Libre Part 4.
Let's do it, boys.
Can't wait.
Later.